Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following. Welcome to Full Bloom, the award-winning show that celebrates life. Here's your host, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian. Tonight's guest has been described as a modern prophet. She is, or at one time was, a chaplain, an artist, a writer, a police officer. And believe it or not, she has found a way to combine all of those paths into one new path, storyteller. She's going to talk with us tonight about her latest focus, and that is on biblical ancestors, particularly the stories of women from the Bible. Her name is Sandra Mattucci. Sandy, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Zita.
So your background, as I mentioned, is quite colorful, and I want to talk a little bit about each one of those so we see how that tapestry gets woven together. So, chaplain, past, current, tell me something about that.
It is a tapestry of color. As a
Yes.
chaplain, early on, as a young child, I always knew in some fashion I wanted to serve God. What did that mean? And probably the most influential person in my life was my grandma. Well, she had suffered a major stroke and for 13 months laid in a hospital bed. And I was studying at that time in school.
How old were you?
I was only 22, 23 years of age.
Young woman.
And I was studying contemporary ministries with a specialization in psychology and counseling. And what did that all mean? What did that all mean? But I would do trips every once a month to go and visit my grandmother. And she couldn't speak. And I remember my faith, my inner spiritual journey, my struggle, sometimes just the tears just flowing down my eyes. How could this be happening? And it was my grandmother in her inability to speak. Put her hands on my hair and then just put her hands together. She asked me to pray without speaking. And I was so touched and moved by that. And I was like moved by people where sometimes you didn't even have to say anything. It was just a touch or a kind word, and it made a difference. And I said, here's what I'm going to do. So I plunged into this field of pastoral care at 25. And it was life-changing. I think in the first week where I thought I was bringing God to everybody, it vanished within seconds. It was almost like I was walking into God or an image of God in every human I sat down beside who shared their story with me, that were vulnerable enough at the most difficult moments in their life, and sometimes their last and final breaths, to just let me be present beside them. And I worked as a chaplain for 15 years, and I still am today, but no longer in a formal setting. But more privately, I do pastoral care.
I would imagine that, once entering that field, you don't take it, you don't remove yourself. It becomes part of you. It becomes in your marrow.
You're exactly right.
All right. So, but you had another career, police officer. Okay. To me, that's a 180-degree difference. How does this come about? What did you do? Where did you work?
I made a major career change at 35. And it was a dream I always sought. I always wanted to be a police officer. So I stepped off the edge. I have a real knack for stepping off the edge and just trusting my gut. And off I went and applied for one town after the other. And finally, the little town of Plainville, Connecticut, brought me in for an interview. And they looked at me and they said, Sandra, police officer, chaplain.
Yes.
Help us. And I said, no, police officer, chaplain. I'm still going to tell them to get on their knees and pray. Actually, it was still serving the public, serving the people. And very often it was the people that I arrested, sometimes in the depths of despair, that, when you brought them in, they would say thank you. They would say thank you. And, people would laugh at me and just say, you just gave somebody a ticket and they thanked you. And you know what? It's just the willingness. And you do see a lot of things.
Yes,
you
I
do
bet.
see countless situations where, you know what? They've changed my life.
So you had two careers, seemingly very different careers, but I see in both of them you're helping people, although perhaps in one career it might not always immediately be seen as helping, certainly in hindsight. But then you had another career avenue, and that was artist.
Artist. Artist, I really do believe I was born with a pencil in my hand.
Yes.
I was always sketching.
Yes.
There was something about bringing something to life on a blank sheet of paper. But it really came to life when, as a police officer, my career came to a traumatic end after I sustained an injury.
Oh.
And being an avid runner, an outdoor person, I now found myself not able to move and in a bed. And now it was like, what do I do? All my freedom, all my deepest prayers, the way I celebrated. Now I was just confined to this restricted place. How do I celebrate? What happened to my life, my path, my dreams, my goals? I picked up my sketch pad and began sketching. I did finish my degree from Minneapolis, Minnesota in the art instruction schools, but without seeing it happen, what I started to do was draw images of persons in the scriptures, from old to new. And it was almost like it snuck up behind me.
What do you mean from old to new?
From the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Oh, okay.
Ancient ancestors from our past who have stories relevant for us today.
All right, now you did bring a portfolio with you, and there are a couple pictures that I want to focus on. So let's take a look here at the pictures here, and I see first there's a woman. Well, these don't look like biblical pictures; they look very much like modern day. So you have an older woman, and then there's a picture of two young women. And this is your work.
Yes.
And but you just said a minute ago that you were drawing biblical pictures. So connect that dot for me, Sandy. Who are these people?
Well, the first woman, the older woman, is Lot's wife, and next to her is her two daughters.
Okay.
Now, when I say biblical images, sometimes that's what I wanted to try and erase, because sometimes we have lofty kind of angelic figures where, you know what, people can't connect to them as persons. Mm-hmm. The persons I have sketched, some of them are actually persons in my life.
Ah, okay.
And in the sharing of these stories, the women who you see today, if I can share with you, Lot's wife. Let me give you a little bit of a background.
Okay.
She's married to Lot.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Obviously,
that's a given, yes.
An unnamed woman.
Yes.
This is very important for me as in the telling of these stories. So many unnamed women, so many stories that haven't been told, and there's stories within the stories. So here's Lot's wife, and they're in the house, and next to her are her two daughters. Mm-hmm. Again, nameless daughters. And they're in this town that's just ravaged with hardship, and everything is out of disharmony. And Lot's uncle, Abraham, is pleading with God, please don't destroy this town. Please don't destroy this village. If there's 30 good people, 20 good people, 10 good people, God's not giving up. God is going to eliminate this town. So God sends two people to Lot's house to warn Lot, to say, you must flee. You have to flee from this village. Take your family. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the people of the town, intoxicated, come to the door and they pound on the door. Let us in, let us in. They're drunk and they say, let us have our way. Let us have our way with those two angels. In the scriptures, they were said to be angels who came to Lot's house to give him this message. And Lot opens the door and just cracks it open. And he says, wait, don't harm these angels. I have two virgin daughters. Do with them what you will.
Oh, great.
Do with them what you will. Now imagine the mother, the unnamed mother in the background, and the two virgin daughters, children, no voices, no voices. Well, Lot does go out because he's told to gather his family and get them out of this village. And he goes to his two sons-in-law, in the village and says, we must flee this town because it's going to come to an end. And his sons-in-law laugh at him. They laugh at him. So he comes back and he gets his wife and he gets his 2 virgin daughters, and they depart. They leave the village, and all of a sudden from behind they hear the explosions, they hear the rumbling, they hear death. They can smell the stench in the air. And all of a sudden, in many of the presentations that I have given, I've asked people, what comes to mind when you hear Lot's wife? Well, the first thing is,
Pillar of salt.
She turned back.
Well,
she did the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
She did the wrong thing. But here's this woman seeing her husband ahead of her and her 2 virgin daughters, and she sees hope for them. She sees hope.
Because they're leaving.
Mm-hmm. Right. But back in that village, she has 2 daughters. She perhaps has grandchildren. Everything that she birthed into life, her grandchildren dancing around her table, the meals that she prepared, all that she celebrated is in that town. And what does she do? How could she not turn back? She has 2 daughters there. She's a mother. How could a mother not turn back knowing that her 2 daughters are dying in that rubble, her children? And we all of us, men, women, children, know what it means to lose somebody. Mm-hmm. But this mother, a milky substance flowing down her cheeks. What was it? What's in our tears?
Salt.
Salt, a natural ingredient, a preservative. Lot's wife stood there as a pillar of salt, letting her daughters know, I will always be here for you. I will never turn my back. And those ancient ancestors of our past, do they not share messages with us today for our children?
Sandy, that is a beautiful story. It's a rendering I've never heard. And I know from conversations you and I have had before that you travel around, you give the oral story, using the oral storytelling tradition. You tell these stories about women in the Bible. And part of what you say is that these are the untold stories. So I then wonder, where did you get the story? Do you look at whatever evidence was there and then use your imagination and say, I can understand that through this perspective, through the perspective of the mother, of a woman, so the stories are a product of how you are seeing that world.
Yes, yes.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful. Now, I know that you've told the stories of other women as well, and I'm going to get to those in a minute. In fact, when you do talk with people, and I know you've gone to, church groups, libraries, school groups, what surprises them the most? Let's say this story in particular.
I think what surprises them most, and really what just touches me so deeply, people who have been in a church community their whole lives look at me and they say, we never heard this.
Yeah, not that way.
We don't even know these characters. Or we do, like you said, Zita, we haven't heard it this way. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been broken open to us. Or I have friends who have not been in church, who don't belong to a community, or practice a different faith experience, or understand God in a different way, or give God a different name, who when we sit down and share these stories, there's connections.
That's an important thing to bring up, and I do want to talk about that for a minute. For those of us for whom Christianity is not the path, and that perhaps not familiar with the Bible, what's the advantage of listening to stories like this?
I think the biggest advantage is that you're recognizing regular, ordinary human beings that walked and struggled and doubted and questioned, and even some of the people within our own scriptures, they didn't have a faith background. They found something deep within themselves, and You know, it wasn't always about the chosen people. We could talk about other characters, and there's just so much. It's just so packed.
Well, let me ask you, is that why? Is the idea of making relevance for people today who either are or are not on a spiritual path that includes the Bible? Is that why you sketch these characters as modern day people with modern clothing, with glasses, with a modern haircut, and so that there's relevance in today's world?
Most definitely, because I think the stories of the Bible have been lost. And a lot of people say to me, Sandy, why are you going back to the old? I'm going back to the old to bring about new. That's my message, breathing life into old stories. The stories haven't been heard this way. So I'm taking people back because it's relevant for us today, because we are now the vessels bringing about peace and justice and mercy. And by our telling those old stories, we invite everyone to now celebrate their story. Because the Bible doesn't end, those of us who are Christian, at Revelation, in my understanding. We are a continuation of the gospel message. Each of us has our story.
All right, now I want to, we have a couple clips that we're going to show. And I want to preface this by saying I attended a weekend retreat with you, taught by Jan Phillips, at Wisdom House in Connecticut, sometime last spring. And I remember you wanted to give almost like a rehearsal presentation of the stories, and you were going to share them with those of us in the group. And our friend Marcia Brown, videographer, came down and she said, well, I'll film them for you so you can, see how it works. Well, thanks to Marcia, she created, made a few clips for us to share today. So what we're going to see are some clips from a weekend retreat that Sandy and I attended to introduce this work to this community. Now, the first clip is going to be about a woman from the Bible whose name is Hagar. So set the scene for us and tell us a little about Hagar.
Okay, Hagar is the maidservant of Sarah. Now, we all know Father Abraham, who's given the promise that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. One problem: Sarah. She's barren.
All right, I'm going to stop you right there, and we're going to pick it up in just a minute. And what we'll do now, if we could, is roll that clip about Hagar, and let's see you in action here.
Okay, Hagar, Egyptian slave woman of Sarah the princess. We know Father Abraham, his descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. We hear that story. But what about Hagar's? Hagar was ordered by Sarah to lie with Abraham because Sarah was barren. And back then, a woman's role to give offspring to her husband. So Hagar does just what she's ordered to do, and they bring to life Ishmael. And they love Ishmael. One problem. Remember that word that I talked about from the very beginning, jealousy? Well, Sarah had a complete change of heart. A complete change of heart. And you know what? She began to bully, abuse, threaten, beat Hagar. Don't we know that today? The bullies. What's happening to our kids in the schools? Because of bullies. Not just children, but adults. Because we're different.
All right. I look at that story and I think, well, number one, you're a phenomenal storyteller. But I also look at that and go, yeah, we had an issue of bullying. And I mean, today you can't watch the news, open up a newspaper and not see it. But I never thought of it the same way. It's like, okay, there was bullying back then too. So there's certainly contemporary relevance here. Is that what you wanted the audience to pick up from when you tell that story?
That is exactly what I want to bring to life for the audience. I want them to see that those sacred stories from the past are relevant to us today. Yeah. Especially, I shared with you Lot's wife, Lot's daughters, Hagar being bullied by Sarah. It's our children. It's our children who I really want to get the message out to, because if we don't act now on behalf of our children, what do we leave them? What do we give them in our future?
Yeah, we do have an obligation to provide a legacy. We do. And Sandy, I'm going to ask you to set up a little scenario here for the second clip. And if you're just joining us, this is Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian, and I'm talking with my friend Sandra Mattucci. She is a multi-talented woman, and her latest project, she sketches people from the Bible, oftentimes in a modern interpretation, but you go around the state, around New England, around the country, telling these stories and showing the modern relevance. And we have another brief little clip here, and this one is about Lot's wife. And you talked with us a little bit about the story of Lot's wife, the woman with no name, earlier. But I do want to take a look at the clip to see you in action again with storytelling. So let's take a look.
Do we have human trafficking going on today? Are we selling our children? Listen to the messages. This is not just 6 million years ago. This is today, now, the same people that God loves. And the story is alive. It's real today for us. But you know what? They flee the town. They're told to flee because the Creator's going to just eliminate it. And Lot takes his family and his 2 virgin daughters and his wife, and they flee Sodom and Gomorrah. And what do we know about Lot's wife? All we know is she looks back. And when she looks back, she's turned into a pillar of salt. But here's what we don't hear in between the message. Why did this mother, this birth bearer, why did she turn back? How could she not turn back? She had 2 more daughters in that town. Lot went to his sons-in-law and said, we have to flee, and they laughed at him. He forgot his 2 daughters. And what about the grandchildren? But the mother had to turn back. That is everything she birthed. Her life, her spirituality, her faith, her purpose. She turned back. And how could she not? Tears flowing from her eyes. Grieving mother. What's in our tears? What's in our tears, people? Salt. Salt.
Oh, gosh, Sandy. It's so powerful. I mean, I feel like I've been blessed twice. You shared some of it here with us, just on the spot. And also we see the clip, before the other audience. I just want to emphasize the value of stories, the value of having people hear the stories. Even if the Bible is not a part of their spiritual tradition, what's the value of hearing the story?
The value is, again, the gift of story. I'm repeating just what you said because in many ways I do believe the sacred art of storytelling has been lost. And Thanksgiving is coming soon, and we'll all gather around the table. And what do we do when we gather around a table? There's no laptops. There's no cell phones. Well, maybe a few will go off.
Yeah.
But what do people do? They recall. They remember. They celebrate. They make new traditions. Remember how we could just sit down and talk and share? We've lost that. But I think people want it back. People want it back to sit down and share and listen. And in my sharing of the story, it invites somebody else to add something new to it, or they might hear something differently than I brought to life, and they bring newness.
Well, when you tell Lot's story, do people say, oh, well, I would name her something, XYZ, Susie, Lucy, Samantha, Mary? Does that ever happen?
I don't ever hear anybody saying, like getting lost, like, can we name her? I think people are kind of drawn to the nameless woman and want to hear about all those other nameless women within the scriptures.
Well, let's talk about some of those. What are some of the other stories? Who are some of the other people?
So many I could name. We have the Syrophoenician woman. We have the woman at the well. We have the woman kneading the dough. We have the woman with the hemorrhage. For 12 years, this woman is bleeding. And she's vesting all her monies to try and be healed. And because she's always in her flow, her menstrual flow, at that time in the Jewish tradition, she was cast out of community. She wasn't allowed to be a part of. But now here's something happens. She hears this healer's coming to town. He's actually coming to town to heal Jairus' daughter. Well, this woman with the hemorrhage, she completely interrupts the story. She listens to a deeper voice within herself. Her consciousness is stirred. And you know what? She's going to cross the line. She's been told not to touch anybody because she's unclean, but she doesn't care. Somebody's coming that can make her well. So again, she crosses that line and she goes through the town touching everybody. She doesn't care. And everybody's saying, oh my gosh. And all of a sudden she sees the one she needs to touch, the Christ. And she says to herself, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I know I'll be well. And she throws herself down and reaches the hem of his garment. And all of a sudden she's changed. She's changed. And all of a sudden the Christ stops. He's with his brothers traveling. And all of a sudden he says, who touched me? And his brothers look at him like, who touched you? Look at all these people. Who hasn't touched you, Jesus? And now the woman knows. She knows that she's been caught. And she looks at Jesus and says, I touched you. And he says, woman, your faith has made you well.
Oh, Sandy. See, I knew the story, but not like that. So I have to ask you, because my guess is, I'm sure there are some of you out there who are thinking the same thing I'm thinking now. I want to hear more. I want to see more of the stories. How do people find you? How do, go, you have a website.
I do have a website.
And that's called
One Single Drop.
OneSingleDrop.com.
How fitting is that?
Very fitting. So they can go to the website, get in touch with you, or of course, they can always get in touch with me and I can put them in touch with you. And you speak to groups and organizations and do presentations all over the place, and more stories in the making, I assume?
Always more stories in the making, because in my prayer, I plunge into the scriptures daily, and newness is always happening.
Sandy, thanks very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you for bringing the sketches with you, and a big thanks for doing some of your performance art for us, right here on the show. Appreciate it very much. Also, a thank you to my Full Bloom crew. And I say this every week, and I mean it sincerely. I do know the value of time. And thank you once again for sharing an evening with me. Do join us again next week. Bye-bye.
Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following: